This is the DRF Players Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Tuesday, July 12th edition of the DRF Players Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornatale, back with you alongside the usual crew. From the DRF offices in Manhattan, we have Mike Hogan. Mike, what's up?
Not much, Pete. Just another beautiful day in New York City.
I like the sound of that. And what I'm hoping is a beautiful day in Texas. We have Jonathon Kinchen. Jonathan, what's up?
It's not beautiful here. I've been trying to break my Skype on purpose so that I didn't have to face Mike for losing in my head-to-head.
We'll get to that in a minute. But a lot to talk about on today's show. A little bit later in the program, going to let Mike and Jonathan get some work done and bring in for the last 10 minutes or so Keith Chamblin of the NTRA to talk about the NTRA legislative efforts to change the crazy tax withholding rules for horse players. He's been working diligently for many years. There's some news from the week. Want to get an update, explain to people what this all means. We're going to review some races from the past weekend. But first, I just wanted to tell my personal story of the weekend, which was it was not Perrin's first baseball game, but it was actually technically her second baseball game. But it was her first baseball game in New York, and I think we can all agree, they count more when they happen in New York. So in that sense, her trip to see the Brooklyn Cyclones down at MCU Park was her first New York baseball game, and what a game it was. Not only did we see a triple play, but actually, thanks to my cousin, Tio Tomas, who was sitting next to me, got Perrin her very first baseball, which happened to be fouled off up into the stands. And then 2 pitches later, the guy hits the home run to put the home team, the Brooklyn Cyclones, ahead. It was a pretty magical experience. And I know, well, first, before I ask Mike, because I know he had a cool sporting experience with his son over the weekend, but I wanted to ask Jonathan, have you guys done any sporting events yet?
Yeah, no, we did. We did, living in Austin and going to the University of Texas, we went to two. We went to a basketball game, which was fun. He was not a fan of the pyrotechnics to start. In fact, he says, Dad, let's go to the game, but let's wait until after the fire. So he wasn't feeling that. And then we went to a football game on Thanksgiving night, and it was pouring rain. He wasn't feeling that either, but I haven't lost him completely on the sporting thing. He had fun at Del Mar, had fun at Lone Star Park. But, yeah, those are the two other sports he's been to.
Speaking of selling your children on racing, Mike, tell us about your weekend experience.
Well, I learned a couple things. I learned the LIRR stops running out to Belmont Park after the first post, so you got to get out there early. So we had a little bit of an adventure taking the F train and then a city bus through beautiful Queens. But we got there eventually, got to see some races from the rail, got to check out the paddock. Of course, Teddy was very, very excited about the ice cream truck just on the other side of the paddock. He was also very excited about the play structure even further away from the paddock, and particularly liked the little horses that you can ride on there. So maybe perhaps we have a budding bug jockey in the works.
I like it. I like the sound of that. I'll give you the wise guy hack. You just take LIRR to Floral Park or Belrose. There's a few stations that you could just do, and that you could take the LIRR at any time of the day, and then just take a cheap Uber over. That might be the move in the future, rather than the old F train bus double. That just I'm feeling like road rage just thinking about trying to get a family out there under that prescriptive element. The Floral Park train's kind of fun. There's a bunch of bars that are near there. One of them I went to the Sunset Friday. We were out there again, courtesy of listener and my buddy Timothy Day. It's actually kind of wild. From the street, it's just a coffee shop. But you go in and there's a phone booth, or what appears to be a phone booth, which is actually a door that opens into this speakeasy. And it's right there in Floral Park. The cocktails were proper. probably not so appropriate to take the little kids there, but on some other, especially on these Friday night late posts at Belmont, which I just couldn't be a bigger fan of, a great place to get to. The coffee shop is called Roast. I'm spacing on the name of the speakeasy. It's got like an Irish bar name, but it's definitely more of the cocktail type of deal. But anyway, lots of fun to be had out there at Belmont Park. They had contests this weekend. One of them, now, did you follow this story, Jonathan? It's pretty fun what happened with the Belmont contest on Sunday, I think it was.
I didn't see all the details, but I got a group text in our group text that I have with all my racing friends. Eric Bialik said, the first rule of tournaments is to follow the rules. So I'm assuming that someone did something that they weren't supposed to do that affected their outcome.
That wasn't the story I was going to tell, but now I will tell it. The story I was going to tell was now 75-year-old John O'Neill getting the job done, going all in late in the contest to punch his ticket back to the NHC. I thought was great. It is true. There is a rule in New York, and it's not a contest rule. It's a New York State rule that you have to play half of your races at the host track. Now, this was never really a problem in the Mythical Money days, but with the advent of live bankroll, it makes for confusion. And I know Donnie Nelson, tournament director, had signs all over the place and did a great job telling folks. There were a couple of people, unfortunately, in the Sunday contest who ended up betting more out-of-town races than they did local races and had to be DQ'd. And I spoke with Donnie about it, and I could just hear the pain in his voice, how much he didn't want to have to do that, how much he understood. It's not like people were trying to get an unfair advantage, but this is a state statute. The way that it's written, you have to play at least half of your races on a New York State track. So he really had no choice, and it's not an easily changed rule. This is basically going to be the way it is for the Saratoga tournament too. Folks are going to have to pay attention, and they're going to have to make sure that they don't make more than half their plays at the simulcast tracks. Speaking of Saratoga, we launched our first qualifier for those Saratoga tournaments, which are going to be happening August 10th and 11th last week. We're going to be running feeders starting Wednesday, and I think they're as cheap as $12 to get in. And you'll have a chance, if you play in a feeder, finish in the top 10%, you advance to the weekend qualifier. Top finishers in the qualifiers will win 2 seats to Saratoga. And I'm pretty sure you can do that any way you want. If you just want to play in one day, you could have 2 entries for Wednesday, 2 entries for Thursday, or you could take 1 for Wednesday, 1 for Thursday. Michael Bachok, the $1 Million Man, friend of the podcast, he won the first one, and I did a little piece with him yesterday. Very controversially, I thought. He said that other than the NHC, the tournament he wants to win the most is Saratoga. What do you think of that, Jonathan? Is that crazy talk, or is that something that you can relate to?
No, I mean, that place is pretty magical, and I think that if you, the size of the tournament, the quality of racing, the amount of people, of quality players that show up, it's been around for a while. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's a large tournament. I don't know what their total. They usually get 200 plus for that, and so that's it makes total sense to me. In fact, when I think one of the podcast listeners tweeted us asking what we thought was kind of the third major outside of the NHC and the BCBC, and the first 2 that came to my mind was Del Mar's summer tournament and Saratoga.
That's very sensible. All right, well, you're backing up the $1 Million Man there. I'm really looking forward to seeing him up there and getting a chance to hang out and maybe even see him across the net on the tennis court. We'll see if my ego will allow me to get thrashed like that. I don't think I can hang with him from as much as he plays, but looking forward to the opportunity. Always fun to hang with him and to see what he has going on at his own tournament website, the Tournament Edge. Talented team of handicappers, including Barbara Boley, who we've had on the show, and also Dr. Anthony Trezza, who I've interviewed in the pages of DRF and over at drf.com. All right, let's get down to a little bit of race review. I think before we get to New York and the conversation Jonathan's just dying to have, we will talk very briefly about Arlington. I'll encourage folks looking for more info about Arlington to read Marcus Hirsch's excellent coverage, recapping everything that went down on the preview day for the Arlington Million, including our buddy Nick Tamaro, by the way, winning his NHC seat there. So waiting for a call back from him to hopefully write something about that for the paper this week. But they did have a bunch of actual horse races there as well, and perhaps these races will take on a little bit more significance with the news this week that Chad Brown is going to be running Flintshire, not in the Million as I expected him to, but keeping him in Saratoga, presumably for the Sword Dancer. First, Mike, I'll ask you, hearing that news about Flintshire, that they're going to be going the less ambitious route than the more ambitious route, does that color your impression of the horse going forward at all?
No, not really. I mean, I think ultimately the bigger goal is the Breeders' Cup, and it's just a matter of where they feel more comfortable in terms of getting there. So, I trust Chad. He's so far he's done pretty well picking spots for his runners, and I don't think the summer is the real goal for this one. I think they got bigger ideas in mind.
The big race out there on Saturday was won by Kasaki, who we ended up seeing the day of the Keeneland tournament, Jonathon, winning a race out there. Do you think this horse, I don't know if you had a chance to review these races, I'm kind of springing this on you, so feel free to defer, but off the top of your head, is he a horse, especially in the absence of Flintshire, that you'd be thinking might have a shot to have an impact in a race like the Arlington Million?
No, it feels like there's going to be some other horses that are going to show up to be a problem. I will say that he is probably the put-over of the year. I mean, that horse ran like fourth in a race at Turfway Park, I think, on debut, and then comes back and wins that race and wins the tournament for the Keeneland tournament winner.
Rick Brough.
There you go. And the horse has come back to rattle off a couple of wins, and so, or at least this win, this greatest stake. So, no, it feels like there's going to be a different horse that's going to show up, whether it be from Europe or another quality runner from here. A horse like Desidero I would take every day over this horse. So hopefully he'll point for that spot. At least I've heard initially that's where Buff was thinking he was going to go with him.
Jonathon Kinchen has been known to wager $1 or $2 on Desidero. Mike, did you have a chance to look at the Arlington stuff at all, or were you totally stuck into New York?
I focus mostly on New York, but I mean, look, Kasaki looks like he's a nice horse. He's a 6-year-old. He's only raced a few times in North America. But ultimately, I mean, let's talk about it here. Who did he beat in the race? I mean, he beat Roman Approval, who's okay, but he's not a grade 1 animal. He's not one of the best turfers we've got in North America. He beat Messi, who's, maybe been a little disappointing in a few of his races since coming over here. Not a top turfer in North America since coming over from Europe. Go Around, who, may be a good one in the future, but, he hasn't proven it yet. I don't think the best horses were racing at Arlington, and I'd be surprised if any of those were the Arlington Million winner.
Beverly D contender Fawfilet won over the weekend. She's, of course, out of Six Perfections, Breeders' Cup Mile winner. Be interesting to see if she wants to go as far as the distance of the Beverly D. For me, it would be a little bit of an in Graham Motion We Trust situation, and it always seems that race brings over some interesting contenders from Europe. Jonathon, did you see that race, and do you have any thoughts on Fawfilet, and if you think she could be a contender come Million Day?
I didn't. You know what? To be honest with you, as sad as it is, that division happens to be the most boring division I think we have currently in racing, because it just has such a clear standout that it's just not really that great of a story. And so I haven't really followed it. I wasn't following Arlington much. The only Arlington races I watched were the ones that Nick texted me telling me that he was what his bet was, and so I tried to root him home. But no, I didn't get a chance to watch that race back, and so I don't have really an opinion about that one.
One other note I saw in Marcus's piece that I thought was worth pointing out: we've talked so much about the success Mike Makers had with claiming turf horses. His claim, Green Grass of Wyoming, ran well in the Stars and Stripes, and Marcus said, though, that he's more likely to be coming to Saratoga for the John's Call than he is to be sticking there for the St. Ledger, the American St. Ledger, on the Million undercard. I thought that was a good note. Again, be sure to check out all of Marcus's coverage of of Arlington from that last weekend and beyond. We'll hopefully get him on the show in advance of actual Arlington Million Day. All right, let's move back to New York. Mike, you were there in person. Were you able to get up close to any of these horses? Did you see anything paddock-wise or hear any interesting gossip, any interesting firsthand reporting from you on the scene, or was it more all about the playground?
I saw a little bit of the paddock and got down to the rail a couple times, but most of it was just running around having fun with the family. The horses happened to be running. The horses happened to be walking by. We went over and we pet one of the saddle ponies while the horses were in the paddock for the Belmont Sprint. But that was really more the focus. Of course, I watched the races during and after, but while I was there, it was more dad duty than DRF duty.
Makes sense. Makes perfect sense to me. Been in that position many times. Jonathon, we'll let you start off. Let's go straight to the head-to-head bet that you had with Mike. Remind listeners what the situation with that was, and why don't you give us your version of what happened?
In a head-to-head situation, if you ever go out to Vegas and you play in those head-to-heads, a great angle, and I'm not making an excuse here, but a great angle is having a forwardly placed horse versus a horse who's going to come from off the pace. And Mike picked a classy forwardly placed horse. I picked a horse that was going to be coming from off of it, and those two horses stayed on well. Catch a Glimpse obviously did, and so did Coolmore. And so there's not too much to it. I got beat. The funny part about it is regardless of the pick 4 outcome, I was in the back of the field looking to find out if Decked Out was going to catch Coolmore, and I was like, oh, she's not going to get there. And then I turned back to the front of the field and realized that I had hit a B horse with Catch a Glimpse and became even more frustrated. So it's part of it.
Well, for me, I was so angry at myself after this race, and I absolutely loved Ballydoyle in this race, who I think had the littlest bit of an excuse just in that she didn't break and just never, it was just a total non-effort. It's not really an excuse so much as just sometimes it happens. You don't break, you don't run, whatever. I liked Catch a Glimpse. I liked Time and Motion, as I mentioned on the show, as a backup horse. I basically had everything running through those two. And then the race runs, and afterwards I remember, hey, wasn't I listening to a podcast a few months ago where some guy said, never in the history of American racing have distance concerns mattered less, and you should always include the best form and figure horses when you're designing your multiple race exotics? Yeah, well, that was me, and I'm an idiot because I didn't listen to myself. I didn't have Catch a Glimpse for a penny, so the sequence for me runs AAXA, and I get nothing, and was just absolutely disgusted with myself. Credit to the winner, Catch a Glimpse. She ran pretty well. Coolmore, the way I would imagine, Mike, you had a moment of nervousness out of the gate when it appeared to me that Jamie Spencer was riding her as a rabbit. She didn't break either, and was just very aggressively handled to get up in there. We can have an interesting debate about the pace situation of the race. I'm a little bit contrarian, I think, to most people in that I think that on the day in general and the way that turf has been playing has not exactly given closers a fair shake. And I do think Catch a Glimpse may have benefited from that, even though the fractions themselves were honest. That's just my read. There's other very smart people who have the opposite read. But Mike, what are your thoughts in general about the Catch a Glimpse performance and the Belmont Oaks in general?
Well, you mentioned Coolmore's break. As soon as the gate opened, I said, oh, geez, it's done. She's done. And then Jamie Spencer guns her up, gets her caught wide into the first turn, and I thought, oh boy, there's no way. And then on the second turn, he's going for Catch a Glimpse, trying to make a race of it. And I thought, boy, this filly is running huge. All things being equal, she ran really well to finish third. Catch a Glimpse. What can you say about her that we haven't said? We've doubted whether she wants the distance. I know some people, particularly Mike Watchmaker, have doubted whether she's gotten some easy trips. Most recently, in the Penn Mile. No matter what's thrown at her, she overcomes it. She takes the lead if she's given it. She can sit and close. She's a really, really classy filly. And you mentioned the Beverly D. Why not catch a glimpse for the Beverly D?
Probably just because there are other spots against her own sex in Saratoga, but it's not crazy. You don't see a lot of American 3-year-olds go that route, but it's not nuts. Have we heard what the Cassie's plan is for? Anybody?
I haven't heard, but that's not a crazy thought. But it's one of those deals where, it's a tough spot for her, right? Because in the direction she's traveling, the obvious spot for her, it kind of works out perfectly with Tepin, because Tepin's going to go in the mile, and her winning at a mile and a quarter, and especially at Santa Anita, would suggest that she's going to be, facing elders in the filly and mare turf, going, I think it's a mile and 3/8, I think, at Santa Anita, if it starts down the hill. I'm not 100% positive about that, but which is a trip I think that, she'd get a trip similar to Day at the Spa did a few years back. So I think they will probably wait, since the end of the year goal is going to be to challenge older. You feel like they would just kind of keep running her against the 3-year-olds. There's a pretty good 3-year-old turf division at Saratoga. Get her up there, get the Cassies rolling at Saratoga, and then point her out to Santa Anita in the fall.
I misspoke before, of course. I said against her own sex. I meant her own generation. There is that 3-year-old program that a lot of them just go through that would see those couple of races. It's some combination of those races at Saratoga, and then, of course, the QE2 in the fall at Keeneland, where we know she's had success. You got to figure that's definitely going to be on her dance card as well. It'll be interesting to continue to follow her along.
All right, I'm gonna interrupt for a second, because there's a fantastic article from David Grenning on DRF.com about the plans for all of the graded stakes winners from the Belmont races on Saturday. And for Catch a Glimpse, he says that owner Gary Barber and Mark Cassie will contemplate several spots for Catch a Glimpse. She earned a win and you're in, of course, fees paid birth to the Breeders' Cup filly and mare turf at Santa Anita. Possibilities for her are the Grade 1 Del Mar Oaks, the Grade 2 Lake Placid at Saratoga, as well as the QE2, which you mentioned, Pete, at Keeneland on October 15th. And he also mentioned the possibility of taking on older fillies and mares in the Grade 1 Beverly D at Arlington Park. So sounds like they've got a lot of options. Obviously, she can get 10 furlongs. You want to probably keep her away from Tepin. It opens the door for a lot of possibilities now.
Absolutely. I forgot about the Del Mar Oaks. Of course, that's another very logical spot. We were sort of all around that one. Let's talk about the other big race for turfers, 3-year-old turfers on the card, the Belmont Derby. I feel like I'm just going to, in my nightmares, see Highland Sky charging down various stretches with a lot of money in the balance for me, and him just never quite getting there. I thought the horse ran really, really well. I had no problem with it, but it was another punch the desk moment for me in the stretch run of that one. Jonathan, what were your thoughts overall on the Derby?
Yeah, I mean, Nick and I both, Tamaro had talked about Highland Sky a lot, and Nick kind of made a good point when I talked to him on Saturday night when he was basking in his third consecutive NHC glory. He said that it's just like that's the kind of horse that Highland Sky is, and that's the kind of trip you're going to get out of him a lot. His style is going to come from out of it in turf races, and he's going to just kind of always be wide and always be pace compromised and always kind of come up short. He's got a big race with his name on it, and he'll win some, but he's going to disappoint you a lot. And so I think that was a pretty good point. For me, moving forward, not only because I picked the horse, but Beach Patrol, in my opinion, ran huge. I thought that he pulled, was wide on both turns. If you watch the head-on and you watch the replay again, I thought he had significant trouble and was affected, ran on really well, caught Camelot Kitten late, and this will be, his next start will be his third start for Chad Brown in that program, and I think that he's sitting on a big race, and I would expect what happens with Beach Patrol, where they put him in terms of the confidence in the spot in which they put him, tells a lot about what Chad thinks about him. If they run him in the Secretariat, he's definitely a horse that I would look for in that spot, suggesting that Chad and the barn think that horse is up to that quality. If they drop him in class or they drop him to an easier spot, then I'll take that as more of a negative and more of a indictment of their opinion of the horse. But I thought he ran huge on Saturday.
That was a great point. I agree. The horse had all kinds of trouble. I would have expected the horse to run last with the way that the early part of that race went. And then the horse obviously has talent and really did very well to be third. The only point I'd make about Highland Sky, if I'm right that the way the Belmont course has been playing and specifically played on Saturday was against the closers, it makes the Highland Sky effort even more impressive. However, that is a great point. Anytime you're dealing with these deep closers, you're always going to have the opportunity to find trouble, the opportunity to go wide, and the opportunity to be pace compromised. But I'm with that. I'm going to continue betting and using the horse. I mean, you're still a pretty good betting vehicle when you can run second at 6-1 to another logical horse. I really am looking forward to hopefully getting a chance to finally score out on Highland Sky at some point. I don't know. Maybe the ship has sailed. Maybe everybody at this point is going to be using him as the all-time underneath key. We'll have to see. Mike, how about you? What were your thoughts on the Belmont Derby?
Well, it's funny. Jonathan kind of tipped my hand because I was going to ask you guys who ran best in the race. And I wasn't on Beach Patrol prior to the race. But coming out of the race, I thought that was a fantastic effort. Jonathan mentioned he was wide on both turns. He also made a big move on the backstretch, and then actually kind of took back a little on the second turn, went wide on both those turns, was quite tight down near the wire, but still rallied to get third. When you pull up track, as he went 45 feet further than the winner Deauville, who take nothing away from him, ran huge as well, and he went. I think 27 feet further than Highland Sky did. He went 16 feet further than any other horse in the field. A fantastic effort. I mean, like you said, he could have finished last, and you would have completely excused that effort. To get third in there and only lose by less than 2 lengths was amazing. All things being equal, I'm with Jonathan. He's an absolute use wherever he shows up next out, assuming he doesn't have a long layoff, assuming there's not some sort of issue between now and then, but a fantastic effort from him.
Do you think, Jonathan, that given the way he was running off in the early stages of the race and given that he's shown that tendency before, is the right move at this point to just give him his head and put him on the lead in a race like the Secretariat, or do you think he's going to learn to rate and relax?
He feels like the type that you should probably just give him his head and let him go on with it. When to fight him like they fought him and to still have the kick that he had, it feels as if you let him relax, the kick will even be more significant and increases chances of getting longer distances, like 1.25 miles. So yeah, he's definitely the type of horse that I think the outside post and kind of where they found themselves is more of a problem. I think if he's the type of horse that draws inside, breaks from the gate, and the lead is there for the taking, I think they would take it moving forward, and I think he'd be a hard horse to reel in.
The horse who actually made the lead, well, he didn't quite make the lead, but he might as well have, given that he was chasing a 70-1 shot, was our winner, Deauville. I thought it was just a great ride from Jamie Spencer. I didn't have him. I eventually, the way I constructed my tickets, had him as an A and Long Island Sound as an A+. But in reality, what kept me from liking him as much as I like Long Island Sound, I was worried about the post, and Jamie Spencer, from what I've seen of his work overseas, fine jockey, but like a lot of jockeys here, he likes to grab. And I was concerned about sort of a grabbing ride from the outside, trying to find position. Wasn't sure I wanted him coming from way back in the pack. Well, he put one over on me because it was a terrific, aggressive ride, sending him from the gate, getting that position. And we've seen it before with a horse like Flincher. When these European horses with their superior stamina, when they can get themselves in position going into that turn for home, then they have a seemingly almost a magical ability to kick away from a lot of our horses. And I thought that's what Deauville showed. I mean, to me, Spencer gets just a ton of the credit for the way he rode that horse. And as much as we criticize jockeys who aren't aggressive a lot of the time, it's nice to see a really positive ride rewarded with a big victory. So I definitely wanted to call that out as well. I think we've covered this race pretty well, but before we leave it, any other thoughts on it, Mike?
Yeah, I was going to say one thing, something I witnessed out at the track. You see these kinds of characters now and then when you go to racetracks. And after the race, I heard one gentleman, obviously a fantastic handicapper, who spends probably a lot of time at Belmont Park, saying to one of his friends, when you see a race like that with three of them, don't try and handicap, just bet them all. So that's my advice to you. Meaning
what? What was he talking about?
The Europeans.
Oh, just bet the Europeans.
Yeah, just bet all three of them. Bet all three of them.
Would have worked this time.
Don't try and handicap.
Yeah, no, exactly. The only thing that I was going to say about the races, we had talked about how do you kind of handle some of the international horses, and I remember when I was looking on Saturday, and I don't remember where, but I found a note somewhere that suggested that Deauville didn't like the soft ground last time at Epsom, and if you looked at his two back at York, it was pretty impressive, and he got. I'm sorry, the one that was at York, the Dante.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was just like I forgave him for that performance, and that's what led me to use him. Because other than that, he would have been a horse that I just wasn't really excited about. And so getting the firm ground and the change in surface from finding that story that he didn't like it soft helped me lead to that horse.
That Dante was run on good to firm ground, and he did appear to have no problems at all with the footing. That's for sure. And we'll let folks find that Dave Grenning article that Mike mentioned to look at possible targets for these horses in the future. Hey, we can't give it all away for free here on the podcast, folks. Let's talk. We got a question that I want to get to. It's a fairly wonky handicapping question, but I want to get to that in the next 10 minutes. But before we do that, there was a lot of other stakes action at Belmont on Saturday. Rather than go through race by race, because we don't really have the time for that, I'm just going to ask each of the guys to name a performance that impressed them or a talking point that they wanted to get to about the other Belmont races on Saturday. Mike, we'll start with you.
Well, I liked AP Indian's run, and Marking ran well as well. The two of them ran great. This sprint division is now pretty wide open. There was a return from Masochistic on Friday at Santa Anita. He ran huge. I think they all put themselves firmly near the top of the sprint division, especially with Run Happy being AOL or AWOL, I should say. Who knows if we'll see him at all the rest of this year. And it's a pretty wide open division. AP Indian right near the top for me.
I have no idea who Run Happy's internet service provider is, but I'm going to take a wild guess. It's not AOL. Though that company, of course, has a good link to DRF, but that's a whole other story. Jonathan, yes. Mike said a few things I want to ask you about before we get to your performance from the weekend. There's actually two separate quick follow-up notes. I'm going to ask them both at the same time. You can answer them in any order. What's going on with Private Zone, and what did you think of the Masochistic return, being the California expert player that you are?
So the Private Zone thing, I'm going to say this is as political as I possibly can, but if you are of the belief that he is going to run as well without Jorge Navarro, I'm afraid you're going to be a little bit mistaken. So there's an emoji for what I think he's missing, and you can search through them and figure out which one it is. But that horse is not going to be the same without Jorge Navarro, unfortunately. That's that point. The other point is that, I think Masochistic's a freak. I've always thought he's amazing. He's one of those horses that gets huge workout reports and has had some situations that haven't worked out for him, just with trip and pace and things like that. But I think he's a freakishly fast horse. In fact, I think that in Andy Harrington's workout report in California, I think the most glaring opinion he's ever had about a horse that I've ever seen is this horse Masochistic. And so I think if things can go his way and he can kind of stay healthy and get going in the right direction, I think he could be a tough horse to compete with on the sprint scene.
I was amazed when I saw that horse in person. I think it was when we were out there for the Gold Cup, not this year, but last year. He cuts quite a figure, just an imposing equine specimen. Doesn't surprise me at all. If he works like he looks, you could see why folks would be raving about him. That'd be a fun story and one to follow. I don't know, Bing Crosby next for him or one of those Del Mar races. Is that what they're saying?
Yeah, I would imagine that the Del Mar. I think there's the Pat O'Brien and the Bing Crosby. I get confused of which one's first, but I would imagine that he'll show up in one of those and be ready to rock and roll. He's like I said, he's a pretty special horse just based on some of the things I've seen him do in the past.
Jonathon, we'll keep it with you for a performance you want to highlight or point you want to make from Belmont on Saturday.
Yeah, I thought Fish Trap Road was pretty impressive and a little bit frustrating because he's a horse that I used, but I was leaning on Tale of Saval there, and we even talked about it. I was leaning on Tale of Saval for moving early into what was a hot pace in the Woody Stevens, and then looking back at it, I didn't respect the horse that was involved in the hot pace, and that was Fish Trap Road, and I thought he ran huge that day. And I should have upgraded him. I thought his performance was pretty impressive. And then I had a non-stakes horse that I thought was impressive. And another kudos. We always try to give them props when they help us find winners like this. And the DRF workout report guys pointed to free money in the first with 6-5 Bobby on Fleek, who won by 6 with A- workouts. You take those A- workouts, and you take that Chad was starting a New York bred an open company. I think that's – and that the horse was another one of those Bobby's kitten angles where the horse was named after Bobby Flay. I'm sorry, not Bobby Flay, but Bobby Frankel. I'll call that free money at 6-5 in the first at Belmont on Saturday.
One like 1-5, that's for sure. A point about both the races we've talked about so far that may have played a result in the outcome. I first heard this idea watching the NTRA broadcast on the day. Andy Serling was talking about the rail not being the place to be. Mike Watchmaker subsequently, in his excellent recap of weekend action, reiterated the fact that he thought the rail wasn't the place to be. Economic Model ended up down on the rail. AP Indian won despite it. I just was curious to get your opinion, Jonathon, a keen observer of bias that you are. Did you have it as a dead rail at Belmont on Saturday?
Until AP Indian, come running up the rail, I thought it was, but I thought it was at least not ideal. But it's one of those things like, when it comes to that, it's either glaring, and I think this is where, we used to have this discussion at the beginning of the year, you and Mike and I about bias, is that I think that people jump to the conclusion too quickly without evaluating the performances out of it. That's the easiest way to understand if it was real or not, is to see horses run back out of it. I think it can be somewhat of a guess trying to evaluate it too early. So it wasn't glaring enough based on AP Indian's run up the rail for me to say that it was. Private Zone stopped on the inside, but maybe, like we said, he might not be the same horse. And sometimes you have to identify the horses that are making you lean in that direction. Why did that happen? And the horses that are performing better than you thought, why did it happen? And sometimes it's hard to identify. So for me, I really don't know yet. I thought it was until the last.
Yeah, I don't think the last really contradicted it that badly, just in terms of how Marking was staying on more than I would have expected him to in an outside path. I just think AP Indian ran just a superior race and won in spite of whatever was going on down there, just from my quick back look through the charts. Mike, before we leave Belmont on Saturday, any thoughts on that issue or anything else from the Belmont card that you want to get to?
No, I'm certainly a believer in things like bias, rail bias, or speed bias. I tend to take a pretty much a wait-and-see approach like Jonathon was suggesting. I'm not sure there's enough that you can really glean. Bobby on Fleek ran huge. That was a race of all firsters. He got to the rail and actually accelerated. So yeah, we'll see. I'm not sure if there was any bias one way or another. I'm not sure it was so striking as to significantly upgrade or downgrade any performances. But that's my take.
That makes sense. All right, let's get to this question before we let these guys get to work and bring in Keith Chamblin. My only last thought on the bias issue before we go is you guys are totally right. That's what you need to do before you can say it definitively. But when you're in the business of trying to make money, being able to find that kind of thing in real time the way that Andy was on the broadcast, or being able to bet with the assumption that it happened before the first horse comes back, that's how you get ahead of the curve and make money. So I am very sympathetic to what those guys are trying to do as well.
I completely agree, but I remember when we had Duke on, one of the points that he made, Duke Matisse, is that identifying same-day bias is one of the most difficult things to do. And coming from someone who I respect more than anyone I've ever seen when it comes to bias, I'll trust that if it's hard for him to find it on one day, it's going to be hard for me to find it in the same day.
Yeah, that's a very valid point as well. All right, so the question was, this is like a pretty down the rabbit hole pace handicapping question, and it had to do with whether any of us look at turn time in our handicapping. I've got an answer to it, but we'll start with you guys. Jonathon, we'll go with you first. Is turn time something that you look at? Maybe we can start by defining turn time for folks. That would be basically if it's the turn time is different depending on the distance of the race. But what I'm assuming this person's asking about is the classic use of turn time, which would be a 6 furlong race that starts on the backstretch, not the first 2 furlongs, but the middle 2 furlongs that occur around the turn. Whether you look at that, the velocity in that segment of the race or the raw time in that segment of the race, and if that influences your handicapping at all.
I used, like back in the day when I was learning and finding out, and I'm still learning, but finding out like what things I liked and didn't like and handicapping angles. I played around with turn time for a little bit. I used to use I used 2 different PPs. I used the DRF PPs and I used another type of PPs as well. And they had
type. An inferior
exactly
type, yes.
A type that I don't use anymore. There used to be like a pace figure there that you could add and subtract 2 numbers and get an actual number that signified the turn time. And it did help me find Winchester on the day that I hit the pick 4 for $84,000. I would have never found him. I used him because he had the highest turn time. So I think there's value there if you can identify a way in which it unfolds. I think it's probably bigger in turf racing than it is in dirt racing, in my opinion, because that's typically when the winning moves happen in turf races. So if you can somehow quantify it in your own way and identify, then I think it is valuable. The tricky part about using the raw number is that with all of the various distances, various courses, using the raw number and just the time, I think it could be misleading. So I think if you can somehow find a way to infuse some type of pace number into that situation where it's, a 55 is a 55 and a 75 is a 75, I think maybe you can identify something there. So yeah, I think that's there's some value to it. It's not a huge part of my game at the moment.
I'm going to just pick up on that because that leads perfectly into what I was going to say. For me, Jonathon makes a good point about knowing where the turn is in the race, too. Turn time is often a misnomer. Sometimes people will just be looking at a certain fraction, not looking at it in terms of where it's actually happening on the oval. So you really need to know your racetrack and know your circuit and know which parts of the race are relevant at which distances before you can make any unilateral statements about something like turn time. For me, what I'd prefer to look at that incorporates turn time but with other information is a pace figure to basically what you'd call in the Brohammer pace speak an early pace figure, which would be looking at from the start to 4 furlongs in sprints or the start to 6 furlongs in routes. And I feel like there you're looking at the turn time and you're also looking at what you'd call the FR1, the first couple of fractions. And I feel like looking at those 2 things together is going to give you a lot better picture of the pace situation and who's making meaningful runs than just looking at the turn time. Because the fact is, if a horse goes slow enough out of the gate, they can run a pretty good turn time and it doesn't matter. They're not the kind of horses who are going to win because they're going to be too far back early. The rest of the field's going to be so far ahead of them that that's not going to be enough. Whereas if you can identify horses who are going to be in the hunt at the pace call that's a phrase I'm lifting directly, I think, from Brad Free's book, Handicapping 101, which is one of the first places I sort of got this idea and started incorporating it into my handicapping when that book came out 10 years ago now. But if you can find those horses that are going to be in the hunt at the pace call, all of a sudden you're looking at horses who are a lot more likely to win. Mike, anything to add or on the topic of turn time? Is it something that you use at all?
Not really. I mean, not in that sense. I think you guys covered a lot of the points that I would have made. For me, moves on the turn often have to do with more than just the time. It's often a visual thing, how well a horse is getting around a turn, how wide they are, ground loss, that kind of thing, along with any acceleration I see. Sometimes you'll see these big loping horses that sometimes don't take the turns very easily, and they need to go wide. A horse like Dortmund comes to mind that's just really big, and those hairpin turns at Los Al maybe weren't suited to a style like his. Those are more the visual types of things that might factor into turn time, but it's not something that I use as, I have to make sure I calculate the turn time for each of the runners in every race for my handicapping.
These days, of course, a lot of that can be nicely automated with a program like Formulator. Folks interested in this topic, I highly recommend checking out, if you can find it, not the easiest book to find, but the Brohammer book, Modern Pace Handicapping. I've just reread it in my blitz of rereading a bunch of classic handicapping books, the kind of geeky thing I do from time to time just to hopefully inspire me as a writer and keep me sharp. But if you can find Modern Pace Handicapping, there's a whole chapter on turn time in there. Very interesting stuff. That book, I guarantee you, some of it's way over my head. It might be over many people's heads, but there's a lot of stuff in there that's just very relevant, as relevant today as it was when it was originally written back, I think, in about 1989. Maybe it was 1992, but it was a while ago. Remains relevant. Really great stuff. All right, gentlemen, we're going to let you go. Any final thoughts? Jonathon, we'll start with you.
Nothing much. I'm excited for my maiden debut in Toronto this weekend up at Woodbine, so looking forward to that. And other than that, nothing much.
Glad you mentioned that. I'll be up there too. We're going to be doing a seminar at Woodbine with Matt Bernier and Tommy Massis Saturday at 11 o'clock. I want all of our Toronto area listeners, you know who you are, to come see us. Looking forward to a chance to meet and or hang out in person. Mike, anything from you before we let you go?
The only thing I'll mention is before you fly to Toronto, you and I, Pete, have a little handicapping seminar. We're doing an online handicapping session using the DRF reports and DRF Plus for contest players. That should be a fun one. It's Wednesday, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. If you miss it, it'll be archived and posted to YouTube.
Look for the banner to sign up for that one. And now we welcome to the DRF Players podcast Keith Chamblin of the NTRA. Keith, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Pete. Thanks for having me.
Folks know you very much from the critical role you've played in the National Handicapping Championship since its inception, but that's not what you're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about these impressive and ongoing legislative efforts that you've been involved in. Listeners, you may get a little bit of a taste of the West Wing on the DRF Players podcast over the next few minutes or so. Keith, let's start with a little bit of history. How did the idea come up in the first place for the NTRA to get involved in the critical issue of tax reform?
Well, we've been looking at the issue of parimutuel tax regulation reform for the better part of 15 years, and for much of that time period, we had been focused on trying to achieve some legislative fix through a passage of a bill that would contain language that would modernize regulations relating to parimutuel taxes. And really, when it comes right down to it, the simplest way to describe what we're trying to do is change the definition of, quote, the amount of the wager, end quote, to include all of the money a player puts into a specific pool, not just the single amount of the winning ticket. And of course, it would have huge ramifications for the industry. We were unsuccessful at achieving a legislative fix, if you will, to this issue, simply because it's darn near impossible to pass any legislation in Washington over the course of the last decade, and particularly difficult to pass legislation that some in Congress may view as being beneficial to gamblers. So about 2 years ago, we were meeting with our lobbyists in Washington, and we asked them to consider another approach. And that was we reviewed the tax regulations and determined that we may not need federal legislation, that we might be able to correct this issue simply by going directly to the Treasury and the IRS and asking them to modernize their definitions on their tax code and fix it through more of a regulatory change. And that's what we've really been focused on for the last 2 years. We've gotten a lot of congressmen who no longer have to pass a bill, but they understand the importance of horse racing to their economies in their local districts and states, and they see the benefits of this. They acknowledge that there's an issue that needs to be addressed, and they've gotten behind the effort, and they put a lot of pressure on the Treasury and the IRS to act to modernize these rules. And of course, we had a public comment period last year where we drew nearly 12,000 comments and from horse players in favor of the issue, and now we're back to where we're doing everything we possibly can to try to tighten the noose around Treasury and the IRS and exert pressure from every point that we possibly can in an effort to get them to act because they acknowledge that we have we have an issue that quite frankly needs to be addressed. They understand the issue, and now we just need for them to do something to fix it. And that's where we're at, but we're not going to just sit back and wait. We're going to continue to apply pressure wherever we possibly can, and that's what's led to some of the actions you've seen in the last several weeks and what you'll see in the next month or so, because I think as a follow-up to the U.S. House passing an appropriations bill that has language in it that encourages modernization of pari-mutuel tax rules, that really gives key members of Congress another opportunity to weigh in on this issue. They can point to this legislation, this language, and say, okay, here it is. It's in a bill. It's been passed by the entire House. You all need to, what are you going to do to address this?
Let's talk about what the difference between an appropriations bill is. It sounds like this is a legislative solution, but really what this is a creative way of doing what Keith just said, of putting pressure. An appropriations bill has to do with funding, as I understand it. So why don't you explain, Keith, what the sort of purpose of an appropriations bill is in general, and how this is a clever way of getting the message of these congressmen and of you and your lobbyists in front of Treasury.
Well, this particular appropriations bill is a massive bill. It's almost a $22 billion piece of legislation. It funds the Treasury Department, the Judiciary, the Small Business Administration, the Securities and Exchange Commission. But most importantly, it funds the Treasury and the IRS. So they pay attention to this bill. It's a must-pass piece of legislation. It's not something that Congress can kick the can down the road to next year. They've got to pass bills like this. That's why we chose this bill. Representative Hal Rogers from Kentucky, who's a huge fan of horse racing, he is the chairman of this committee and helped us insert this language into this bill. And while it doesn't create a law that fixes our tax issue, along with the passage of this bill, there's report language on a myriad items, including this language encouraging the Treasury and IRS to modernize parimutuel tax rules. So it is another way of applying pressure. Unfortunately, it's not a law change, but it's the next best thing, and it'll allow us again to kind of it triggers all different kinds of activities. And frankly, if we don't hear from if Treasury doesn't act, in the next several months on this issue, then we'll go back and we'll say, okay, we've got a House bill that's been passed that includes this report language. By the end of this year, we'll have Senate. We think we'll have a similar bill passed in the Senate. It could happen before October, but it'll definitely happen by the end of the year. The same language is included. At that point, we'll have two bills that will have passed the House and the Senate, where the report language has been included, and we think that sets the stage, if not for a Treasury IRS fix, certainly to re-engage on the legislative front with a fix of another kind that could be inserted into a bill and would have more broad-based support than at any time in the history of our efforts to try to get these tax regs modernized.
You can certainly see, though, how the ability to go to Treasury and say, hey, look, this key group of players supports this idea, and hey, they help control your purse strings. This has got to be a message that they have to listen to. I would imagine Washington a very difficult place to get the ear of something like Treasury and the IRS. But all of a sudden, when you have key players along the way supporting your plan, Keith, that could also control the purse strings for those organizations, it's I would like to think that it's a message that's going to be heard loud and clear. I imagine that's the plan anyway.
Well, no question about it, and it's not. We're not dealing with tonnage here. We're dealing with who can most effectively reach out to the Treasury and IRS and get their attention, and we're just kind of rifle focused on representatives and senators that are parts of these committees that oversee the purse strings for the Treasury and the IRS. And that's who we have on our side. That's who's weighing in on this issue. And we're hopeful that something will be done. We don't know when, but we're going to continue to exert pressure. And just because horse players might not be reading about this issue on a weekly basis, that they shouldn't think for a second that we're not working on it every single day, because we are. It's our number one legislative priority in Washington, D.C., and there's not a day goes by that Alex Waldrop, myself, aren't on the phone with our lobbyists talking about what can we do next, who can we reach out to, what are our options if this strategy comes up short, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to continue to work this, and hopefully, we've made a lot of progress, and we've just got to get it over the goal line.
Dealing with Washington sounds a lot like something a horse player might be familiar with, specifically a contest player. You can't just have plan A. You need to have plan A, B, C, and D all the way down to E and F. And it seems like you guys have played this out in a way that makes a lot of sense, and we're all rooting for you to have success. I know a lot of listeners to the show were active during that public comment period. Keith, is there anything that we, the crew and listeners of the DRF Players podcast, can do to help these legislative efforts along at this point?
Well, I think just stay tuned. We'll keep everybody posted. They understand our issue. They recognize that that these tax rules need to be modernized. Now we just need to get the Treasury and the IRS to act. If we don't believe that we need another public letter writing campaign at this point, but we're not ruling that out in the future. So stay tuned. We'll keep everybody apprised. We appreciate you providing this forum, and hopefully something will happen here, in the next several months. It's impossible to predict, but we're certainly not going to sit idly by without trying to prod them and to get these parimutuel tax rules changed for the better.
It's in the best interest of everybody. Horse racing, an important business in this country, not only for the jobs it provides, but in a state like New Jersey, the green spaces it provides in terms of horse farms and the like. It's an important economic tool in a lot of different states, and we'd like to see Treasury step up and do the right thing here. And Keith, just as a horse player, I want to thank you very much personally for all your efforts, and thank you for your time coming on the show today.
No problem. Thank you, Pete.
All right, that's all the time we have on this edition of the DRF Players Podcast. I want to thank Mike Hogan and Jonathon Kinchen. I want to thank Keith Chamblin again. And most of all, I want to thank all of you for listening. We'll be back with another show, an international edition of the DRF Players Podcast on Friday, when Jonathon and I, or at least I on Friday, will be up at Woodbine. Look forward to seeing a lot of you listeners out there on Saturday. Until the next time, may you win all your photos.